Okay, let's get to this little controversy involving John Fetterman, who, of course, is the Democratic nominee for the Senate in Pennsylvania. This is a key race. He's up against Dr. Oz as the Republican. And Fetterman's still in the average of polls. Let's actually go ahead and put the second piece up here on the screen. The
D2, guys.
D2.
Yeah.
He actually does still hold about a 6-point lead here. But he used to have a wider lead. Most of the analysts believe that, things were likely to narrow anyway. And also, Oz has really been hitting him with a lot of ads on crime that seem to be having an effect. But the other component of this race is, of course, the fact that Fetterman is recovering from a stroke. And, has been fairly open about the fact he's recovering from a stroke. He pulled back from doing many public events, many interviews. He's only doing one debate, fairly close to when the election ultimately is. He's talked about how, you can tell in his speech that it's not all come back. It's obvious. He's talked about how he has a lot of auditory processing issues where he has to have closed captioning to be able to really understand what questions are being asked and the context of the conversation. So all of that is ongoing and very open question over how voters are going to feel about that as they head into the polls. So, and one of his first big sit-down interviews since the stroke, he sat down with a reporter for NBC News. And there was this one part of it, of something she said about what her interactions were like with John Fetterman that has proved to be very controversial. Let's take a listen to that.
We had a monitor set up so that he could read my questions because he still has lingering auditory processing issues as a result of the stroke, which means he has a hard time understanding what he's hearing. Now, once he reads the question, he's able to understand. You'll hear he also still has some problems, some challenges with speech. And I'll say, Katie, that just in some of the small talk prior to the interview, before the closed captioning was up and running, it did seem that he had a hard time understanding our conversation.
Okay, so this was seized on by some right-wing outlets and by the Republican Party. They clipped on that part and were sharing this. And this provoked a huge, huge outcry saying basically it was inappropriate.
At her.
At the reporter.
Yeah.
It was inappropriate for her to say this, that it was ableist, et cetera. And I'll tell you my opinion, then I want to hear from you because I know you had a strong reaction to this as well.
Very strong.
I didn't honestly understand the freak out in either direction. I am not a person who thinks that it should be off limits to talk about people's health, cognitive abilities. I mean, we've talked about this a lot with President Biden,
Feinstein,
Trump, with Feinstein, all these people. They are auditioning to be public servants. I think it is completely on the table to have this discussion. I didn't think it was inappropriate what she said at all. I also didn't see it as this great gotcha that the right sort of wanted to portray it as, because he has said very clearly, I need the closed captioning. I have trouble, with auditory processing. You can see if you watch the interview, he's clearly capable of understanding what's being asked and formulating cogent responses. He just needs the closed captioning. So I was like, he said he needs the closed captioning. You're saying he needs the closed captioning. That's perfectly consistent with how he's portrayed things.
So I think if we had locked it in there, I would completely agree.
Yeah.
It's the outrage at her, which is driving me insane, because the smear campaign, which has been directed at that interviewer, Dasha Burns, is outrageous. They are attacking her as some anti-disability, ableist, activist. Did she say anything about you shouldn't vote for the guy because he needed closed captionings? Is that what she said? No. She reported the truth, which is he seems to have trouble understanding what I'm saying without closed captioning. That's up to you in order to consider that. By the way, I actually do think it's a huge problem. You could say otherwise because he is not forthright about his medical condition.
No, I don't agree with that at all.
Well, Krystal, he's only saying that he has trouble with auditory processing. He refuses to say whether he has problem with his cognition and will not release his medical records.
He's said very clearly.
Yeah.
I mean, he's released things from his doctor that have said, and you can tell from the interview, he doesn't have any problem with cognitively responding to it. He says, I have trouble when processing, from an auditory perspective. I need the closed captioning. I don't think that's an issue. And frankly, I also don't think that it's been an issue for voters either. He has been upfront about that. So that's why when I look at this, I'm like, what's the gotcha? She's saying he needs the closed captioning. He's saying I need the closed captioning. I actually appreciate that he's been candid about that and hasn't been trying to hide that he is in the process of recovering.
Well, I just disagree because he refuses to release his most updated medical records, and the fact is that he could have had cognition problems, and we have no idea. Until a medical doctor says it.
He's submitting himself to interviews, so we can see that he doesn't have cognition
Well,
problems. I mean, he actually just.
I mean, whenever he's replacing words and can't place things correctly.
You also have to be like, you also have to be even-handed here. I mean, he just sat for a big editorial interview with the Philadelphia Inquirer that Dr. Oz is unwilling to do. So he's actually subjecting himself to more public scrutiny than Dr. Oz is in terms of what his views are and how he would handle these things. So like the freak out about he needs to be more transparent. No, to me, he's sitting for these interviews. This is not the only one that he did. He's done a bunch of them. He has submitted himself to much more mainstream sort of press inquiry and transparency than ultimately Dr. Oz has. So I think that's a very unfair characterization.
See, look, I'm not going to say that Oz shouldn't do the interview. What I'm saying is that you can't rule out cognition problems unless a doctor says so. He refuses to release his medical records that say it to the otherwise. This is one of 100 jobs in the world. It's a tremendously important job. And frankly, like saying that a guy who has very obvious brain damage, and that's literally what this is, you can ask Dr. Sanjay Gupta, who did a whole segment on this, that's a real issue. I mean, this is a very important job. It requires a lot of stress.
Yeah, but again, I actually think it's more important to know what your stances are on issues and how you would vote. And that's what Oz has shielded himself from having to answer any real hard questions on, because he knows that the piece on abortion in particular is very uncomfortable. So like the outrage about Fetterman, who is out here subjecting himself to public scrutiny, you know, in a very transparent manner, seems completely out of step with the treatment of Dr. Oz, who's allowed to not sit for these interviews, not subject himself to press inquiry, and like gets a pass. I just don't agree with that.
I'm not going to give Dr. Oz a pass either.
Yeah.
He should sit down for an interview. Well, and he's not doing it because he's also scared of his position on abortion. Like, let's be very
Yeah, that's obviously what's happening here.
Yeah.
Here's the other thing, and I think we probably disagree on the politics of this as well. Like, you know, the polls have tightened in this race, something that we expected would happen all along. It's Pennsylvania. No candidate was going to win this state by 10 points.
Right.
That was just never going to be realistic. But I don't think it's the stroke recovery thing that's been an issue for him. I honestly don't think that voters care that much about this stuff. I mean, we saw this with Biden as well. Like, they took a look at this guy. They're like, clearly he's slowing down. But you know what? I still prefer him over Donald Trump ultimately. I honestly think it's been the ads hitting him on being, quote unquote, soft on crime that has been much more effective. So I'm not sure it's even a smart strategy. In fact, I don't think it is a smart strategy for Republicans to really hone in on this component as their main line of attack against Fetterman versus, you know, some of the things that they've gotten traction with on crime.
That I agree. I mean, look at the data. How many ads are they running about his brain damage? Like, none. How many ads are they running about crime? All of them. So I'm only looking at this in the vacuum of the people who are basically trying to smear this poor woman for just doing her job. I would have appreciated seeing this for Dianne Feinstein, for Strom Thurmond. This is the problem, which is that we have these, you know, quote norms where we're supposed to just bow to whoever these quote unquote disability activists are and not actually and accurately describe people's mental. If you want to vote for him, be my guest. Me personally, I already had hangups about Fetterman, so I'm already biased, right?
Right.
I'm trying to put myself in a position.
Look,
somebody
to
who I
me,
really liked and had brain damage. Honestly, I don't think I would vote for them.
To me, what his positions are on, you know, healthcare, drug prices, I mean, marijuana legalization, there's a million things that he supports, which are much more in step with my views. And I think that's the way that most voters ultimately look at this. And also, I mean, saying brain damage, it might be technically true, but it's also very loaded. You can see he's subjecting himself to these interviews. You can see he is able to very clearly articulate what he thinks on all of these various things, which is more than you can say for Dr. Oz at this point. So you're right. I think it would be right for Feinstein and, you know, Biden and a lot of other people besides who are 85 years old and a lot of questions about how they're hanging in there. It would be definitely better and appropriate if they were mandated to subject themselves to this kind of public scrutiny. It'd be better if Herschel Walker, you know, subjected himself to this kind of public scrutiny. It'd be better if Dr. Oz subjected himself to this kind of public scrutiny. So I don't think it's fair to attack Fetterman for doing the thing that we actually want him to do. I did think the criticism of this reporter was completely over the top. But I also don't think it should be disqualifying. I mean, me personally, I don't think it should be disqualifying if you need closed captioning. You know, like if you're hard, there are a lot of people who are hard of hearing. There are a lot of people who are deaf who might struggle with.
I don't think.
I don't think that it's hard to have like an accommodation to have closed captioning doesn't seem like a big deal to me. And if it doesn't exist, it should exist because people who are deaf or hard of hearing should not be shut out of public office just because they have trouble, you know, reading lips or understanding what's going on without having that accommodation.
Totally. Look, if it's only closed captioning, fine. But like, look, there's a lot of questions, and he's much more at risk of having another stroke. You never know. As I understand it, with these events, it can also lead to like follow-on brain events. All I'm saying is like you can't rule out the cognition, and I think that's a problem.
But again, he is subjecting himself to more scrutiny and more transparency about what he actually thinks and his ability to perform than anyone else. So yeah, voters ultimately, like, they get to decide what they think about it, but I think he should be applauded for actually subjecting. He could have not done this interview very easily and would have gotten it. No one could have even really said much about it, since Oz is not subjecting himself to these interviews either. He could have just stayed quiet. He could have tried to hide the reality of, how his stroke recovery is proceeding. So I think he deserves to be applauded for having this level of transparency.
I'm glad he sat down for the interview. I actually do wonder, I'm curious what you think, whether it was the pressure for him not wanting to debate and not having done interviews in the past as to why he did it in the first place. I wonder whether he wanted to show strength in like his ability, or whether he felt compelled to do this or whether he wanted to do this.
I think they've decided as a political strategy that the best thing to do is just be upfront.
Yeah.
And I think that they're correct about that, because if he was in hiding and not doing interviews and not being upfront about the fact like, hey, I need closed captioning, for the debate, and I need closed captioning for these interviews, and he did a couple podcast interviews where he needed the same thing, I think it would actually fuel this direction more, because it would raise more questions, then you could paint whatever portrait you wanted to paint. So I think with a lot of attacks, not just with regards to health, but a lot of things, the best thing you can do is just be upfront about like, yeah, this is what happened, or this is where I am, or this is how I'm feeling. And then it takes some of the teeth out of the attack. I will also say that he raised like $1 million in a day after this interview, because there was so much like backlash and controversy around it and whatever. But, I think generally speaking, obviously it'd be better for him politically if he hadn't had a stroke and didn't have to answer these questions and could focus on his positions and his critique of Oz and all of those things. But, I think he's sort of taken the best possible political strategy of being candid about how things are going that he possibly could.
Yeah, I want to see how he does in the debate. That's going to be interesting.
Yeah, cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.